Hi there, this is Unmesh from PiXimperfect, and today I'm going to share with you how to perform extreme color matching for composites in Photoshop. And to make things more challenging, we're going to take the picture of the subject taken in daylight and match it with the picture of the background taken at nighttime. So without any further ado, let's get started.
Life is for living. Let's see where the summer
Back in the magical world of Photoshop, and if you want to go ahead and download this photo and follow along, check the links in the description. So here we have a photo of a beautiful old street, and we're going to place our subject right here. So let's open our Finder or Explorer and just drag it and drop it. Now, the next step is simply making the selection. How do we make the selection? Now, there are lots of ways of doing it. There's pen tool, there's select and mask, tons of ways, and we have lots of videos on this. We're not going to spend a lot of time here. You can take all the time in the world to use your favorite selection method and be accurate with it. I'm just going to select any of the selection tools like the quick selection tool or the magic wand tool. And in the later versions of Photoshop, you will have this option called select subject. Photoshop will use its AI to automatically select the subject. For a moment, let's turn off the background and click on select subject. It's going to use its AI, and it does a pretty good selection to work with. Now, it did leave out a couple areas, and to fix that, you can also use a lot of tools, but my favorite new tool right here is the object selection tool. Let's choose lasso, and all you got to do is to tell Photoshop which parts of the image are not a part of the selection. All right, so hold the Alt key or the Option key. See, it turns into minus. So I can just roughly say that this is not a part of selection. You don't have to be accurate with the edges. It does a pretty good job with it. So once you do that, it will do some calculations, and have a look. It does a pretty good job. Now I want to tell Photoshop, all right, so include this by holding the Shift key. It makes it plus. Now, sometimes it might show this error because it's too small. No problem at all. You can select the lasso tool right here and then just hold the Shift key and just manually add it. Okay. If there are some extra areas you see, like this area, so we're going to go back to the object selection tool, this one. We need to subtract this from the selection. So what is the key for subtracting? Holding the Alt key. So let's make a selection and tell Photoshop this is not a part of the selection. And it does a pretty good job, as you can see right here as well. Of course, this is not a part of the selection, so let's subtract it out. This is the track, not the subject. I don't know what Photoshop was thinking. Maybe Photoshop thought this was a leg. With the lasso tool, let's subtract it as well. And rest of the areas are pretty darn good. It needs some correction right here. So we will have to just subtract it properly. Subtract this area. I'm not speeding up anything so that you know how much time it actually takes to do it. All right, let's just do it this way. Let's subtract from here. Now, lasso tool is something which I wouldn't suggest. If you really want to have the best quality, pen tool is hands down the best. All right, we have a rough selection. We can always come back to the selections later and just finesse it with the brush. But for right now, it's fine. Let's turn on the background right here and click on the mask button with the active selection right there. If you click on the mask button, the active selection becomes the mask, as you can see right here. Everything else just goes black, which means doesn't show up. Now it is pretty good. Next step would be simply matching the colors. Now there's a problem I see. If you have a closer look at the subject, it's right that the light is coming from the top in the original image, and even in this image, the street lights are at the top. However, they are on the left hand side. But on the subject, the light is coming from a little bit of right hand side. So what do we do to fix it? Just use your mind, simply invert it. So select the lady in red. I know you already thought of that. Press Ctrl or Command T, right click on it, and then choose flip horizontal. Now it's flipped. Now it's looking better since the direction of light matches, right? The first step is matching the brightness, and for that, let's take away the colors which might be distracting us. And for that, click on the adjustment layer icon and then choose solid color. Choose any color with 0 saturation. All right, hit OK, and then change the blend mode from normal to color. That way it takes away all the colors. We are just using the luminosity check layer. If you want to know more about check layers, check out this video. Too many checks. All right, wish I got them. Let's create a curves adjustment layer on top of lady in red, and then whatever we do right here, it's affecting the entire image. We want it to be limited just to the lady. So click on this button called Create Clipping Mask button. That way, whatever you do here will be limited to the layer which is just underneath it. Look at this arrow right there. Okay, first of all, let's take down the highlights, zoom in, and on the very right, we have the highlights because the right hand side represent the highlight and curves, left hand side represent the shadows. All right, let's just take away the middle point for a moment. The highlights are kind of matching, right? Let's create a point in the middle, take it down to add in a little more contrast right there, and have a look. The brightness is matching so much more right now. We might have to adjust it later, but right now it's pretty good. Pretty good to go ahead. The top part is looking alright, but the bottom part has a little bit of brightness in it, right? If you look at the original image, it had a little bit of smoke kind of stuff, so we need to get rid of that. We need to make it darker. So let's create one more curves adjustment layer, and this time we will have to use masks. So click on the adjustment layer icon and then choose curves again. And we just want to limit it to the bottom area, but first of all, let's darken it way too much. So click on the middle to create a point, darken it a lot, alright? Then select the mask, press Ctrl or Command I. Now keep in mind, we also want to limit it to the subject, and for that, what do? We click on this button, Create Clipping Mask button. Now, with the mask selected, you take the brush, take a soft round brush, just like this. Make sure opacity and flow at 100, and you know what are we gonna do next? Dab. So dab from the bottom with a huge brush, dab from the bottom with white as the foreground color. Pretty good. Let's take it. Okay, this is better. Alright, now let's adjust the opacity because we think it's kind of too dark. That seems to be about right. What do you think? Yeah, that looks okay. Now we need to create one more curves adjustment layer because I feel there are some parts of the image that need to be treated differently. And select the mask, press Ctrl or Command I, and click on this button right there, Create Clipping Mask. And now let's paint again at the bottom. Alright, let's control the opacity. I guess let's leave it at somewhere about 40. So the brightness is pretty much matching right now, and it's already looking pretty good. Now you can go ahead and turn off or delete the luminosity check layer. So let's go up and simply turn it off. Now let us match the color. And for that again, let's create one more, one of my favorite tools, curves. And this time we'll focus on colors, the RGB channels right in here. So as you can see, the highlights have a lot of yellows, so we have to match that. So let's start with that. We have to start somewhere. So click on the drop down right there and let's go to blues. Why blues? Because blue is the opposite of yellows, right? So let's take the highlights down. Also, we need to make sure that it's just limited to the subject layer. So click on this button, don't forget it. Okay, so we're gonna take it down, something like this. Now the blues seem right to me. I feel there's a lot more contrast in this than it should have. So let's go back to the RGB channel and just brighten up the shadow areas and darken the highlights areas just a touch. Kind of looks a little better. Now when you decrease the blues, it tends to add a little bit of green to it. So if you zoom in, this one looks alright. But if you want to go to the blue channel and if you decrease it a little more, you will feel that there's a tinge of green. But in this case, I don't see it. So if you see that in your images, you might have to decrease the green just a little bit. But in this case, I don't see much of it. So I'm going to leave it at a little bit of it, and it pretty much looks okay. Make sure, keep in mind that we don't want the skin to look like the walls, yellow as the walls. We don't want that to happen. Just make sure the skin looks like skin, but it has a little bit of yellow to it. Now to make the colors match even more, you can take the help of gradient maps, and you can create your own gradient maps from this background by simply clicking on the adjustment layer icon and then choose gradient maps. And from here, you can choose a gradient map that you can create with the background. So let's turn it off for a moment. Let's single click on this bar again. And then on the right hand side, you can choose yellow, the bright yellows from the lights. Now in here, you can create one more, maybe just sample this color, this yellow in right there, looking pretty great. On the left hand side, you can sample the browns. Maybe let's take away the white and do something like this, do a gradient like this. Looks pretty good. Hit OK. And now all you gotta do is turn it on and also limit it just to the subject. So hold the Alt key or the Option key, click on the line between these two layers. This will create a clipping mask as well. That's another way to create a clipping mask. But then again, it's kind of too much. So decrease the opacity and let's set it to something like 35. Now, one other way of creating more accurate gradients is that if you can get this plugin, this is one of my favorite plugins, and it's ColormapX. We already have made a video about it. You can check it out right here. And if you want to check out the plugin, you can go to pix.live/color. So let's keep only the background turned on, and you can keep only one solo layer turned on by holding the Alt key or the Option key. Click on the layer to just turn only that layer on. So let's open up ColormapX by going to Window, Extensions, and NBP ColormapX. Now all you gotta do is to decide how many samples do you want to generate. You don't want to generate so many samples, about 4 or 5 is fine, and hit Analyze. It's gonna generate a sample from this image. Maybe we want a little bit more. Maybe let's go for 6. Alright, 6 samples, pretty good. Look at this gradient, pretty nice, isn't it? Now all we have to do is to turn back on everything by holding the Alt key or the Option key. Click on this eye to turn back on everything. Select the topmost layer, not the luminosity check layer. That's extra. Alright, now let's apply it. Click on the 3 dots apply color grading, and it applies a gradient map of the same samples, and by default it chooses soft light as a blend mode and opacity 50%. Isn't that exciting? You can change that later. However, for our purpose, let's change it back to normal, and we only want to apply it to the subject. So hold the Alt key or the Option key, click on the line between these two layers, and the best part about it, you can always go back and change the samples or edit it in any way you want. So let's double click on it, double click on the symbol, single click on it, and then you can adjust the colors. So I want to take this color away, I didn't need it. So adjust it so that this matches more. So let's take it a little more towards the right, this one towards the left. See how nicely we are matching the colors? Okay, all right. Now, still I think it's too much, so let's go ahead and apply something like about 35. What do you think? It's matching a lot. Already, we are making a hit. Now, we might have to do some minute burning. If you have a closer look at the bottom, look, these areas just look too bright and I just cannot digest it. So click on the adjustment icon and then choose curves, and let's take it down. Now, I'm begging you, please do not memorize the steps. It is just like if you feel like you need to brighten certain area, just create a curves and brighten it. If you feel like you need to add certain colors to certain areas, just create a gradient map or whatever method you choose to add color to it. There are no steps involved. Please do not memorize the steps. Just understand how things work in Photoshop and you can create your own steps. All right, never memorize steps. All right, so let's limit it again, and then click on the mask, press Ctrl or Command I, and then take the brush, and this time let's go for a lower flow. Let's go for 5. All right, looks like a good number. Now let's just brush it in right there with white as the foreground color, just darkening a little bit. Here's the before, here's the after. Look what we did there. Just a little bit of, darkening, making things a little streamlined. Let's increase it to 20. Just apply it right here. Now I know we are missing the shadows, but we'll take care of that later. But at the moment, see how much better it looks? Just a tiny bit of adjustment. Now let's go ahead with the shadows. Now where are the shadows? Behind the subject. So we need to create it behind the subject layer, some of the shadows. So just above the background, let's create a brand new layer and let's name this Shadow 1. Now shadow is something which we will create in a lot of layers combined. Shadow 1. And for that, we can sample any dark color on the ground. So this dark color seems to be about right, and change the blend mode of Shadow 1 from normal to multiply so that we only darken stuff. Now let's decrease the flow to somewhere about 5 to 10%. Let's go for 6% and just darken certain areas. That's all you got to do. Now I feel like the flow is not too much. Let's go for 40%. Creating these soft shadows around. Now keep in mind, these are not the final shadows. To make the shadows realistic, we need to create them and develop them in a lot of layers. Now this seems to be about right for the first layer of shadows. Let's take a look. Here's the before, here's the after. And to me, it seems like it's enough. But if you want, you can create one more layer and this time choose a darker color, black. All right. And you can take 5% flow and you can change the blend mode to multiply, but it won't make sense because it's already the darkest color. But you can do it anyway. So let's click on shadow. Let's name it Shadow 2 and just darken. Now she does look grounded and we can actually stop right here. It looks pretty good, isn't it? Now we also need to darken certain areas of her dress to kind of complement the shadows. So at the very top, let's create a brand new layer. We also want to limit it to what? The subject. So hold the Alt key or the Option key, click on the line between these two layers, and then you can just, to complement the shadows, just add a little darkness here and there. Paint with black. Just simply painting with black, nothing complex right here. Okay, let's zoom out and take a look. Here's the before, here's the after. Just kind of to match it, you can decrease the opacity if you want to. So I'm going to set it to about 55%. All right, looks pretty good. Let's do an overall darkening. Okay, that looks good. Now you can come back to the shadows, Shadow 1, Shadow 2, and decrease the opacity and adjust it according to your liking. So for me, I'm going to set it to about 80%. And now there's one more shadow that we need to create. Shadow number 3. And what's that shadow going to be? Now, when you have street lights, there can be multiple shadows because there are multiple lights, right? For the light coming from the back, we also need to create a shadow. If you have a closer look, now one of the great ways of finding out how to create the most realistic shadows in a particular scene is to look at the original shadows of the existing objects. So if you look at this object right there, look at how the shadow is falling, right? From behind to the front. So we need to create the same shadow for the subject as well, right? We already have a mask of the subject, so we don't have to create a selection again. So hold the controller command and click on the mask. Now we have this selection right there. And let's create a brand new layer. Let's name this shadow 3. Let's fill this up with black. So press Alt backspace on Windows, Option Delete on Mac. Now this is black. Press Ctrl or Command D. Press Ctrl or Command T to transform it. Right click on it and then choose Distort. And then you can just bring the shadow down in that direction. Just follow this direction right there. Yeah, this seems to be about right. Okay. Once you're satisfied with it, hit enter or return. Now, of course, we need to match it. So let's take it back. Okay. All right. Now, also, we need to do one more thing. The shadow, as you can see, it's very, very sharp. So what do we need to do? We need to blur it a little bit. Let's go to filter. But before blurring it, you know what? Let's convert it to a smart object so that we can change the blur values later. So right click on it and then choose convert to smart object and then go to filter, blur, and then Gaussian blur. Let's go for 4 pixels. What do you think? Let's go for 6. 6 would be too much or what? 6 is okay. We can always change that later. Now look at the shadow at the back. It's like a gradient. It's going from dark to transparent. So we also need to apply it to this one as well. Just a little gradient. So with shadow 3 selected, click on the mask right there. And the gradient should start from where the subject is standing. So with the gradient tool selected from white to black, let's start from right here and end right there. How does it look? Not very realistic. Let's end right here. That would be realistic. Now there's one more problem. The shadow is just too dark. Of course, we need to decrease the opacity. So let's set the opacity according to that shadow. Just watch that. Keep watching it right there. Okay. And then accordingly match it. So to me, 62 is kind of okay. Now look at the subject, how grounded she looks right now, isn't it? Now this composite does look complete to me. But if we zoom in, have a look. How is this possible that the face of the subject has lesser details than that of the background? So we need to manage that. Just add a little bit blur to the background. And to do that, let's make a copy of the background. Let's go, select the background layer, press Ctrl or Command J, and let's name this background blur. All right, let's just convert this layer into a smart object by going to filter, convert for smart filters, hit OK. All right, let's go to filter, blur gallery, and then tilt shift. Tilt shift is great for these kind of alleys and streets. And we want the blur to start from here where the subject is standing and go back to that very end. Also, we have to consider the walls too. The top of the walls won't be blurred and the bottom of the walls won't be sharp because they are in the same focal plane. So we need to add one more point right here. Simply click there to create a point and then rotate it. Okay, for this wall, along this wall. So we need this blur to start from right there and go till the back. One more point on the right hand side and rotate it. See what we are creating right there? We want the blur to start about right there. And the dotted line is where the blur goes from 0 to whatever number you choose. So for this one, let's add a blur of 10. Not too much. We don't want to create a very shallow depth of field. We want to preserve the details to an extent. Or maybe let's go for 8. Okay. When you hit OK, it creates a much better result. So here's the before. Too much details in the background. Here's the after. It's looking much better. Now you can go ahead and increase the values if you want to. That's completely up to you. Now the top of the subject looks a little dark. So assuming that we have a street light right over here, which is outside the frame, there should be some light falling on the subject. So let's create another curves adjustment layer at the very top. I know there's tons of curves. Let's take this slider on the right to the left just a little bit. And then we also need to limit it to the subject. Hold the Alt key or the Option key, click on the line between it and select the mask, choose the gradient tool from white to black. And then we can create a gradient. Something like this. How do you feel about it? Looks pretty good, doesn't it? So you can control the opacity because we usually tend to go a little over the board. Let's go for 45. We can always come back and reduce this. And now it's time for us to add some global effects. Whenever we have done matching the colors, done creating the shadows, done doing dodging and burning, done matching the light, at the end, we need to apply some global effects to blend them all in even better. The first thing we're going to do here is to add some noise, because when we blurred the background, we didn't have any noise there. We could have added noise in blur gallery, but then again, we need to add an overall noise because the noise levels of the subject might be different from the existing background, and it just adds some uniformity throughout the image. And to do that, press Ctrl Shift N, Command Shift N to open up the brand new layer dialog box. change the blend mode to overlay and click on fill with overlay neutral color, hit OK. Now this fills the layer with 50% gray, and we know that overlay is a blend mode which hides everything that is 50% gray. Now let's go to filter, convert for smart filters, so that when we add the noise filter, we can change the values later. Hit OK. Let's name this grain or noise, whatever you want. Let's go for filter, noise, and then add noise. 25% is fine, uniform. Make sure monochromatic is checked, hit OK. But the noise is just too sharp. Let's add some blur to it. Filter, blur, and then Gaussian blur. Maybe 0.6. What do you think? 0.6 is okay. Or yeah, 0.6 is fine. But the noise is everywhere. We don't want the noise to be in the highlights. And that's exactly how photos are, right? No, not so much noise in the highlights, but a lot of noise in the shadows. So double click on the right hand side of the layer and take it away from the highlights by taking the slider of the underlying layer from right to left. By the way, it's too harsh. So hold the Alt key or the Option key, click on the slider to break it apart and take it all the way apart. Okay. Hit OK. Now look at the noise, how uniform this image is looking right now. If you're watching this video in 4K, you would be able to notice it. All right. Pretty good. The next thing we can do is to add some global color grading. Now there are lots of ways to color grade. One of my favorite ways is color lookup tables. So click on the adjustment layer icon and then choose color lookup tables. It's the lazy man's way of color grading. I am one of them. So let's go for Fuji Eterna. How do you feel about that? Looks pretty good, pretty grungy, pretty antique, pretty old. Let's go for 60% opacity. Pretty good. Let's add one more curves at the top to add some more brightness to it. Hold the Alt key or the Option key, click and drag the slider on the right to the left. Just when you begin to see these artifacts, it just means that you're losing details on those areas. It's fine to lose details on light sources, but not so much on the subject. See, if we go too far, we are losing details on the subject. So about at this point, it seems to be okay. And there you go. Here's the before, here's the after. Still, I think it's too much. So let's go for about 65%. And now have a look at the composite. Look how well it is matching, isn't it? So if you have a look at the before, there's no way I can show you the before. Let me try to do that. Let me change the panel size. So I'm going to go to panel options and small icons. So if I turn off all the adjustments, look at it. Just look at it. Turning off all the adjustments. Look how badly it's matching. When you turn them back on, look how much better they look. Have not turned on all of them. Now take a look. Now you might want to go back and change a few things here and there, because now when I'm looking at it, I might want to dial down the curves that I added at the top. So at the very top, I guess I had added some curves to brighten up the subject as far as I remember. All right, so this is something I need to dial down. See, about 35. Okay, let's go for 30. Okay, now we need to just brighten up the shadows a little bit. So it was something I was dealing with in this layer. So let's just brighten up the shadows, darken the highlights a little bit. See, we can always go back, and that's the advantage of adjustment layers, is that we can always go back. So this is with too much contrast, little contrast, it looks much better. Look at this. And also you might want to add more color lookup or dial down the existing ones. That's how we perform extreme color matching in Photoshop. Let's take a look from the very beginning. So we had this background, night lit background. First of all, look at where the lights are. These lights are street lights, and there can be multiple lights. So there can be multiple shadows, multiple instances of shadows, and not just even lights. The lights are bouncing off the walls, right? And also falling on the subject. So the shadows can also be soft. So we have the background. We brought in our subject. It's not matching at all. We selected it. We masked it out. Okay, we extracted the subject. First of all, we corrected the brightness. Secondly, we also masked in a couple areas and corrected the brightness area-wise. We again did the same thing. And then we tried to match color with curves. So let's turn it on. If you have a closer look, we just simply brought down the blues to bring up the yellows, and then brought down the greens just a little bit. And if your image shows a lot more greens, you might have to do it even more. And in RGB, I thought there was too much contrast, so I just reduced the contrast a little bit. On top of that, we applied a gradient map. Gradient map to match things a little more. Now, gradient map is an adjustment layer which maps the colors of highlights, midtones, and shadows. On top of that, one other curves to add some darkness at the bottom. And again, on top of that, something to match the shadows, original shadows. And by the way, we already had to create the shadows. So shadow 1 was just a soft shadow to just ground her. Shadow 2 was a little more dark to ground her even more. And shadow 3 was just mimicking of this shadow. Now when I look at it, I might want to even just go lower, 50 or probably 55. Okay. Now we also had to blur the background because once you zoom in, there's a lot more detail in the background than the subject. So we blurred the background a little bit. Also, the subject was looking a little dark, so we brightened her just a bit. And then we added some grain to unify everything. Then we added a color lookup to unify everything. We added the curves to unify everything and brighten everything up and add more punch. So that was all there is to it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, make sure to give us a like, and also don't forget to subscribe, and not just subscribe, ring the bell so that you don't miss any other future tips, tricks or tutorials. I would like to take this moment to thank all these nice and amazing people for supporting this channel on Patreon and helping keep PiXimperfect free for everybody forever. Thanks so much for your support. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys again in my next one. Till then, stay tuned and make sure that you keep creating.